right, folks, let's do this. My name is David Parsons. You are listening to Nostalgia Trap, the show where we take a look at our collective and personal pasts, try to make sense of them without the rose-colored glasses of nostalgia, with eyes wide open. Today's conversation was an opportunity for me to think about a lot of the music and culture that I consumed in the 90s and how that fit into and shaped my personality. My guest today is Sean Nelson. He is a writer and musician, probably best known for being the lead singer of a band called Harvey Danger. They had a massive hit in the 90s in 1998 called Flagpole Sitta. Put it on right now. I guarantee you've heard this song a million times in a million places over the years. This was a ton of fun. We had a long conversation. We ended up talking about culture changing from the 60s to the 70s all the way to today. And Sean was I think, nice enough and I think candid enough to talk about what it's like to have a massive radio hit and this kind of surreal feeling of creating a bit of the soundtrack to American life in the 90s and beyond. This was really fun. I hope you enjoy this. It's a two-part conversation. So if you want to listen to the second part where we really get into the history of Harvey Danger and what that was like in the 90s coming out of the Seattle scene, go to patreon.com/nostalgiatrap and subscribe. The link is in the episode description for this one. I appreciate it. Enjoy this conversation. Here is me talking with the one and only Sean Nelson. All right, Sean Nelson, it is an honor to speak with you. Welcome to Nostalgia Trap. How's it going?
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
You and I have been talking on email for a little bit about the 60s and the 90s. There are a million places we could start, but I guess I want to thank you because in preparation for speaking with you today, I discovered an interview with. I was reading an interview with you in which you mentioned Head, the Monkees film. I had never seen that movie before, dude, and I watched it last night, and it's like it's the missing link in a lot of ways. When did you discover that movie? Because for those that don't know what we were talking about, it's a 1968 film directed by Bob Rafelson, written by him and Jack Nicholson, and it's a Monkees movie, and it's wild.
Yeah, I got really obsessively into the Monkees when MTV started showing the series in 1986, which was the 20th anniversary of the show going on the air. And I was really taken with it for many reasons. And I was 13, I guess. I must have been 13 years old. And there was the simple pleasures element of it were, I thought it was very groundbreaking and funny and, good. And I liked the music very much. And that was, on a surface level, it was great. But I also was really struck by the sort of self-awareness of it, the self-reflexive nature of just the series, especially the second season, which it was only on for 2 years or 2 seasons, and it was a really interesting cultural moment for the kind of where I know you've written a lot about sort of the underground, and you've talked about it on the show, but where sort of underground things entered the mainstream, mostly in a token way, mostly in the way that, like, when you see a film from the 50s or 60s and somebody says performance art, they'll show, somebody in a black leotard doing something ridiculous and stupid, and it's there to be mocked. But right. It also was sort of that coolness was leaking into, mainstream entertainment, which the Monkees certainly was. It was like Sunday night, 7:30. It was aimed at 10-year-olds. But there was something a lot more subversive going on, I noticed. And then I read about Head, this movie, and it was hard to find, but it was released on VHS, and I begged for it for a Christmas present. It was like $70 in those days to buy a new VHS tape. They hadn't figured out that you could make them cheap and more people would buy them. But so I got it and I watched it. I couldn't believe it. I mean, I've seen a lot of movies, but I have never seen another one like that. Um,
Yeah.
and I think it's that takes the self-awareness, the sort of the meta narrative of this prefabricated
Mm,
rock band at a time when rock and roll was solely concerned with authenticity, and like it was coming into its own as a very like serious art form where the standard for whether it was good or not was how real it was, and how
mm-hmm.
and what capacity it had to change the world. That value got sort of fused to the nature of rock and roll because of artists like Bob Dylan and the Beatles and all the obvious folks. But like the Monkees were very conspicuously not real. I mean, they were nicknamed the Prefab Four because it was a
Right.
TV show and there were auditions and it was actors, and there was a controversy because there were session musicians on the records, and like the same people who played on the Beach Boys records and the Mamas and the Papas record, like bands that never really suffered from being called not real. But the Monkees were so, because it was on television, which was synonymous with bullshit, essentially. The the sort of the cool world rejected it out of hand. At least that was the prevailing
Yeah,
idea.
I always was introduced to the Monkees as like a joke because they were fake. It was almost like
Right,
the same like really simplistic line people say about like professional wrestling. Like,
right.
well, it's fake. It's like, well, yeah, that's kind of the first level of understanding what's going on here. But at the same time, it's like, what makes the Monkees so different? I mean, I guess the corporate prefab nature of it. But to me, it seems like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like there's a sort of recovery of the Monkees in some ways in recent years in terms of their musicianship and what they represented, kind of because it kind of sucks to put them in that category of just like a fake TV band.
I agree. I mean, the thing is, they were a fake TV band, but the what it eventually gets to. I mean, first of all, there's the question of, do you like the songs, and does the music have any effect on you? And to me, it just always did. And partly that's because it was incredibly effective fake Beatles, or Beatles style music.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it's also more than that. And the people who were writing the songs, I mean, one of the guys in the band, Michael Nesmith, wrote plenty of the songs that were on those records, and they were really good. And they got incredibly weird as it went on. But um, I mean, I could easily do two shows a night about just the Monkees. So we can.
Well, the
I want to
movie
go all the way.
itself,
The
yeah,
movie is a deconstruction of this exact dilemma of like, what is real, what is fake. How are you going to attack a showbiz thing for being fake when showbiz is inherently fake?
right,
It is
right.
just a constructed reality. And then again, like, is it less real than the Buffalo Springfield, for example, when in fact Stephen Stills auditioned for the Monkees and almost got in? And one of the most beautiful songs on the Head soundtrack, Neil Young plays the lead guitar, or maybe he plays rhythm guitar and Ry Cooder plays the lead. I can't remember, but like those people were all around there. And the film has, as he said, was written by Jack Nicholson and
Mm.
directed by Bob Rafelson. And Dennis Hopper was hanging around. And there's a shot where you see Dennis Hopper and Jack Nicholson. And, 1 year later, um, using money that was generated by the Monkees' incredible success, they all made Easy Rider, which changed Hollywood forever, and probably for the better. But like, I don't care for the film Easy Rider. I appreciate its historical import, but like, I'd rather watch Head any day. Um, but like the sort of they were sort of an effigy that
Mm.
was a convenient. They were like a convenient scapegoat for the kind of mania for realness, so-called realness, that it took at least 20 years for that to start becoming an interesting subject, when MTV, which was itself a massive exponent of like, fake realness and
Hmm.
constructed reality and all that. So it was just, I mean, those ideas I like they really animated my consciousness in a huge way, and they continued to, and they kind of became, that sort of became just like a major thematic kind of springboard for my
Mm.
understanding of how culture is, and also how it sort of how culture is betrayed by the audience's misreading, willful misreading sometimes of those very values. So
Well, I was gonna say, I mean, it in a lot of ways, and I love all the psychedelic '60s stuff.
yeah,
And Dylan and the quote unquote authenticity out of that era. But it also feels like kind of a curse. Like I mean, I came of age in the '80s and '90s, and there was this sort of like sellout mentality or an idea about like
yeah.
purity and who's pure and who's in and who's out, and in a lot of ways that like twisted my mind up and made me sort of like, I don't know, it got mixed up with my aesthetic judgment, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah,
I was sort of thinking of like, oh, I need to understand where this comes from first and who funded it and the politics of it before I get into the groove of what the art is doing. And that
right.
to me it was really confusing to unpack because the '90s had that dialogue was really powerful in the '90s.
Massively so, and in a funny way, it was the enemy of a lot of expression and a lot of like it's a false god in some ways. I mean, in many respects, the question of selling out is, I mean, in a way, it feels like now we're talking about, when the world was in black and white, because that notion doesn't even exist anymore. It's such a like
It's weird.
fringe concept. It's a thing that people talk about their grandparents having talked about, like it's
Mm-hmm.
because the opportunity to sell out is so rare. I mean, I guess maybe going to work for Google or Amazon would represent selling out if you were like a really passionate programmer or something, but
Mm-hmm.
like, nobody has any money anymore. There's no way to make money at all. And so like the thought of getting paid by a corporation for, I don't know, licensing your song to a commercial or something is really different now, and I have a lot to say about that. But like, but the way it kind of stained the consciousness and was a kind of easy way to write things off as kind of not worth your time or attention because the artist was a sellout. It was just kind of, I was absolutely a victim of that mentality for
Mm-hmm.
myself. Like I I completely dismissed a lot of stuff that, as it turns out, in the fullness of time, has just as much interesting material to consider as any other thing. Like it took a long time, and I think
Yeah.
when music is what is at the center of your world, or films, but I think more music, it's very tempting to kind of, I guess as a form of curating your, experience, to just kind of dismiss things before you engage with them, because I mean, in a way, there's not time to engage with everything.
Right. Yeah. I mean, yeah, you have to create some system to sort of, yeah, some system to kind of decide what to throw away and what to put your attention on. But yeah, I mean, the discourse in the '90s was about this word alternative, which still
Right.
boggles my mind because thinking about like counterculture in the '60s, right? And kind of like what is that alternative culture? And then didn't the Grammys create a category in the '90s for like alternative best alternative music like that?
Yeah.
Radio,
Before that, it was the radio stations. Radio,
right?
alternative radio was now then a category of radio starting in like 92 or something.
So then, we've been talking about Mr. Show, this comedy show
Yes.
on the not in the '90s, HBO with Bob and David. That was put in the category of alternative as well, alt comedy, right? So there's this whole
Right.
alt scene. I mean, these are the things that I was honestly obsessed with
Yeah.
during this era. But now when I look back, I'm thinking like, well, I liked Nirvana, but I also liked I watched ER and Seinfeld. You know what I mean?
Right.
It wasn't such a thing of like uh I only like the stuff that's edgy and subversive. Culture is so, I mean, the '90s was when that 500 channel thing happened, and you're sort of
Yeah.
like swallowed by it all. But it's just interesting to think about that word alternative and alt comedy and alternative music, and where it fits in that larger idea of counterculture because it's confusing to me.
I
Yeah.
mean, rightfully so. I mean, one interesting element of that this is, I mean, it's semi-related. Oh, it's related. But like the term alternative was something that people who were, I guess, fancied themselves extra savvy or who actually were extra savvy rejected that term when it was offered because it was very obviously a kind of marketing framework for
Mhm.
selling people the same shit, only now they were wearing sweaters with a horizontal stripe across the front or whatever, like
I bought
the
that sweater, man.
I had 100 of them, it seemed. There was a time when those stripes infected all sweaters. Um, but it's the same is true of the term Generation X, which like there was a long period where I felt like it was a betrayal of everything true and real and good to even speak those words, that it was like you could immediately dismiss any discourse that included that term at the outset. And it's so funny now because the whole idea of generations has become so it's a first principle now in discourse.
It
and
is, yeah.
and there, because now age ism is the last socially acceptable ism. The idea of people under 30 immediately dismissing anyone from some other generation, some previous generation, dismissing those ideas, and and then also the people who are just a little younger dismissing those people. It has
Hmm.
become a very embattled thing. But in terms of alternative, it was a bullshit marketing distinction. But then so is the notion of decades as a, like as a
Right, right.
meaningful distinction, although it's a useful one to measure time. It's every 10 years. We're very good at thinking of things in tens and fives, and you and in the end you have to surrender eventually when the rest of the world just insists on using those terms. And um in terms of what it actually reflected, well, I mean, Nirvana was as popular as a rock band really could be for a time, and they were different. It did feel different. It felt like a new thing in the mainstream. But they also, that's because they reflected a certain punk sensibility, and the idea of punk became that it was real and authentic, and that's the truth. But the Sex Pistols and the Clash, who were the real flagship bands of a certain version of what punk means, they were put together almost exactly the same way as the Monkees, and the what they did is a different matter. What they represented is different, but like there's only one show business, and it
Yeah.
doesn't matter if you're a juggler or a, like sword swallower or a punk rock singer. It's all the same fucking show. And so
That's
the
in the Elvis movie. I don't know if you've seen the
I
Elvis
haven't
film,
seen
but
it.
yeah, but yeah, there's the idea that there's a circus element going on. That and Elvis resists the idea that he's a trick, but the
Well,
manager is sort of making that money and sees it all as one thing.
artists do. I mean, even using the word artist is like we could interrogate that all day. But the performer never wants to think of themselves as a you know as a product or as
Mm-hmm.
as a geek show, because they believe that what they're doing is unique and important and about themselves in some way. And I am not a great lover of the work of Elvis Presley, but you can't possibly argue that he wasn't a significant phenomenon.
Mm.
And also the fact that Colonel so-called Tom Parker was a fucking carny. He was a huckster, and he also destroyed Elvis, I think,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
in the same way that he kind of rode the wave. But like he was the worst manager that Elvis could have had in a lot of ways. But
Mm-hmm.
Elvis just remained loyal to him. I haven't seen the film, partly because I mean, I could be totally wrong about it, because I guess a lot of people have said So, but like, I don't think that guy looks at all like Elvis, and I have a hard time imagining that he can carry it off, because Elvis is one of those people who you know so well. Like,
Mm.
I couldn't finish watching that movie Blonde. I gave it like maybe 20, maybe 30 minutes, and it
Oof.
was
So it's a
just,
rough one. Yeah.
it's rough, and
Yeah.
it felt, I felt weird about even watching it in the first, trying to watch it in the first place. But like, one can say that they did a great job of making Ana de Armas look like Marilyn Monroe plausibly, or close enough. And it's a funny thing when films get into depicting real humans,
That's what I was
but
gonna say. There's
particularly
an
real performers.
uncanny element to it, especially, yeah, when you're talking about like biopics of transcendent god figures like Elvis or Marilyn Monroe, and you're gonna have an actor play them. It's always weird. I mean, it's weird. It's
Yeah.
weird watching Jamie Foxx play Ray Charles, honestly.
Right. And
That yeah.
they always say, well, I really wanted to do this so it was a performance, not an impersonation. And the thing about Jamie Foxx is that it was just an impersonation, and it happened to be a really great impersonation. And so whatever. But like,
Mm.
I remember that movie Walk the Line about Johnny Cash
Yeah.
and June Carter Cash, and I really enjoyed that movie, though I went in like, Joaquin Phoenix does
Yeah.
not resemble Johnny Cash. Like, but it didn't matter, because at a certain point the thing of the movie took over, and it was plausible,
Yeah. Yeah, it's weird.
and he's a great actor, so it was fine. And so is Reese Witherspoon. So whatever, it works. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And it is really, I think it's a kind of subjective
Yeah,
measure.
yeah, you're right. I mean, that's speaking of mainstream culture, right? How Hollywood tells the story of rock and roll is really interesting. And I mean,
Yeah.
we're talking about like the 1960s. It weighed heavily on us. When I say, I know, we're talking about generations. Who cares about that distinction? But just people of our age, that grew up in the 80s and 90s. The 60s were right there, and I guess I didn't realize that. As I get older, it's sort of like, oh wow, they really were right there. Like my parents had just experienced this.
Yeah.
Like 12 years doesn't seem very long to me anymore.
Well,
Yeah,
think about now how it feels to reflect on the 90s, and there's been somewhat of a revival of 90s things. Certainly the television shows have been revived on the streaming services, and
Mhm.
some of the bands have lasted and lingered, and there's a kind of appreciation for it that isn't just, I think, the nostalgia of people who lived through it. But like, for me, it's like when you wake up, or it's like when somebody asks you how old you are, and my first thought is always, well, I'm 22, obviously. And, oh wait, no, I'm not. I'm 100. Like, I'm certainly not 22. But that's kind of when a certain stage of my consciousness just kind of took a definitive shape. Like my
Yeah, yeah.
adulthood kind of slowly dawned. But that's kind of when I guess, when I felt like my childhood was definitively over,
Mm.
and when I got really engaged with and excited about what was happening right then. But one of the interesting elements of this whole subject, I think, is that when at that time, when what we now must have to agree to just call alternative was regnant, it was I think a value that was like widely acknowledged as worthy, that you were meant to know about stuff that had happened before. You were like, it wasn't merely that you, like, to know Nirvana was to, everybody could be exposed to Nirvana everywhere you went, but really you had to know about their forebear. You had to know about, Flipper, and but also Husker Du, but also Black Flag, or whatever, like the millions of kind
The
of
Pixies. I mean, I
the
discovered the
Pixies, of
Pixies. Yeah.
course.
Mm-hmm.
But like, you were expected to know the antecedents, and not only
Yes.
to know them, but to have always known them. And uh, a lot of people started a thing which has become so much easier in the age of social media and the internet, which was pretending to have known them, like to have been like bummed about the Replacements having ended when they did, and how they did, and the Pixies too. But like, to pretend that when you were a 13-year-old wearing your Monkees t-shirt to the first day of high school, that really you were like the punk at the school. And, most people weren't, but it was very easy to kind of pretend that you did, because
Hmm.
somehow then everybody was. And if everybody had been the punk, it would have been a very different world.
MTV spread it. And it was weird to watch. I think a couple of years ago, this went viral. This little clip on YouTube of a Nirvana concert in Seattle after they had, you know, broke and gotten big, and
Yeah.
and like all the and it was like a parking lot documentary. It was like all
Right.
the people in the crowd, and I was shocked because I was just like, they're all like just ordinary college age kids. Like they seem a lot of like frat type dudes, like just
Yeah.
there to just party. And I was kind of shocked by it because in my mind I was like, yeah, I remember how it was. We all had our flannel shirts, and we were all sort of like, and it just isn't that. That's a media narrative that actually replaces your memory at some point.
Right. And I mean, really, it became true in the wake of Nirvana that everybody started kind of, sheathing themselves in those things. But like prior to that, it was, prior to all of that, I mean, I moved to Seattle in 1991, 91, 92, somewhere in there, like
That's
when,
a hot time in Seattle to move there.
yeah, it was
Did,
the,
did
well,
you did you know that you were going into something historically important when you moved
I knew
there?
that I mean, my father has lived in Seattle since like 1984. And so I had spent lots of time there, but I'd never lived there. And I dropped out of college for the first time. And I, it seemed like a very exciting place to go, but I went there because I had no other options really. That's the way my life had sort of taken shape at that moment. But I also felt, as soon as I got there, I felt really great about it. But you know, to be there in 91, 92, when the world was kind of getting wise to Seattle, the people who were from Seattle, who were like original, actual people who grew up there, if you ask them, that whole scene was dead by 1989 or whatever. There's always that, like
That's
the
the Haight
real thing.
Ashbury thing,
Very
right?
much so. Yeah.
Yeah. That like the neighborhood was they did the death of the hippie thing I think in '67 in the Haight Ashbury, and
That's
I
right.
I wonder how
Referred
much
to,
it's
which I learned about on a Monkees episode, by the way. Peter Tork talks about it. Anyway.
yeah, right. You got to like, where did you pick this stuff up always? I'm thinking about sort of because the 60s were so present when we were younger. Like there I grew up surrounded, I feel like, by the Doors and Led Zeppelin and Jimi Hendrix. This stuff was everywhere.
Yeah.
There's even, I mean, it's one of my like pet sort of hobbies, I think, is thinking about head shops and record shops and
Sure.
coffee shops and all those sort of places where you access that. And it seems like Seattle during this era, I mean, I don't know what that neighborhood is like now. I'm sure there's some gentrification that's taken place
Well,
there, but
yeah.
it seems like that neighborhood was the Haight Ashbury of the 90s in some ways, right?
I mean, yeah, I would say Capitol Hill or the University District were both places where a lot of people who were kind of displaced wound up finding a place. And the main thing about Seattle then was that it was a place where you could be poor or at least broke with some dignity. And like you could get an apartment for $300 or $400 or $500.
Mm.
And and you could get a room in a house that you shared with people for the first room I rented in a house in Seattle was $210 a month. And like that was a sum that required some work to generate. Like you still, because jobs minimum wage was like 475 then, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I earned. But you could do it. It could be done. And then as a result, and there were places where you could eat for $5. And more to the point, there were lots of other people who were doing that, who were roughly your age, who didn't feel like dropping out of school or not even wanting to go to college was the same thing as volunteering for homelessness and failure and whatever. Like there were people who were excuse me. My feeling about it was that I really I don't think I was, well, I was definitely not conscious of this at the time, but the real project for me of living in Seattle was like learning how to be young, because I had never really been very good at it. I had always been, not a great dedicated student, but like an obedient kid. Uh
Mm.
and then I got there and I met all these people who were my age or slightly older, who were like, I don't care about that path. Like, that's not, I'm not playing that particular game. I'm just doing this, and I'm buying a half rack of some like old Milwaukee for $4 or whatever. And like that kind of, it was bohemian in a way that
Mm.
rang true to me, and I found incredibly romantic and exciting, simply because I was such a sheltered idiot that I just didn't know that world really existed in a way that was accessible, rather than a world that was like, well, if you go into that little realm, you're going to get the stink of it on you, and you never get an advanced degree. And
Hmm.
I didn't especially want that, but I was told that I should want it, and so I was scared all the time. And anyway, I got
Yeah,
there and
yeah.
I
This is
found
all very
a path.
familiar to me. I think this is in part why I identify with your music. That there's a connection to the that discovery happening. But at the same time, I mean, it seems like you were aware of Bohemia and aware of the '60s counterculture and all that music. Where were you at with that when you were coming to Seattle in the early moment? Because it seems like culture is connected to that
I
feeling.
I hadn't thought to make that connection then, but of course now I see it. But like, I grew up on stories of that particular romance. Like, my father, he was born in Hollywood and grew up there and went to Hollywood High and stuff. But like, he always referred to San Francisco as his coming of age city. And, he talked a lot about the, Haight-Ashbury being over by 65 or whatever.
Right.
But he had been there in 64 and 63, and like, like people taking acid and smoking weed and like doing, having dropping out essentially was what we're really talking about. That became a thing that there was a, if it wasn't necessarily as magically supportive as you would be, you would want to believe when when you hear those stories, um, there was at least a community of people who were doing the same thing. And the general sense of like, I don't want to get a steady job at an insurance agency or
Mm-hmm.
whatever,
Mm-hmm.
or work for General Motors, or as Allen Ginsberg wrote, turn lathes and precision parts factories. Like, it just had no appeal, because they were often so estranged from their parents, who, because of the values imposed on them from growing up in the Depression times, and also living through a world war, and then another massively traumatic war in Korea.
Mm.
Like,
Yeah.
the idea of having any prosperity and safety and certainty was like religious fervor, like, of course you would want that. But then the cliches about that kind of cutting off their ability to connect to their young kids, who grew up with the expectation of prosperity, because that's what was there for a lot of them. I mean, a lot of them, a lot more of them than had been exposed to that in any previous generation.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
then it was like, well, what about emotional connection, or what about truth, or what,
Yeah. Right. Right.
these things that are like vaunted terms, but it actually was it was a real dilemma for the country, that generation gap that they talk about. Um, anyway, I just, the music of that time was the first music I remember ever hearing, and I loved it. I
Mm.
loved it. I still love it. Um, the Beatles and
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
Stones and Simon and Garfunkel, and it's, the usual suspects. That stuff was all like, it was and remains the foundational text of music, as a thing that is not only like pleasing diversion, but like really gets in your marrow, and helps you feel a certain sublime, connection to living.
Yeah.
And so all of the cultural stuff that grew out of it, which, you know, the NBC nightly news version of that certainly reduced it to, you know, the same 30 seconds of B-roll from Woodstock
Mm-hmm.
and stuff like that. It still was extremely romantic, and also like it felt uh like it had been, I mean, it would be I never would have connected to the idea of it having been really revolutionary, I don't think. But like it was a rejection of what had come before. And that was really meaningful. And what I experienced and what I, you know, how my life kind of took shape from my time living in Seattle for like 26, 7 years, and really identifying with that place and feeling at home for the first time and blah, blah, blah. It did feel like a rejection of what had been expected of me
Mm.
and of a lot of my peers.
That there's like that there's just simply by existing in Seattle, there's something subversive about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, except it didn't it well, I don't it wasn't really subversive, I don't think,
Right.
but that's because when you're there, and this leads into all of the fucking troubles that we have now, but like you know, the thing you when you said when you were talking about like Seinfeld and, you know, like television of that
Mm-hmm.
era, um I I didn't watch television at that time. Having grown up watching television for like 6 hours a day, if I could, I did, I watched so much television when I was a kid. Um, but then I absorbed the idea and believed it, that like watching television was like making yourself a zombie and a tool of the advertising industry. And it was impossible for, even if things were like nominally funny or entertaining, that if you let yourself, you know, take pleasure in it, you were giving fuel to the enemy of
Oh yeah.
life
Yeah.
and the enemy of meaning and, you know, realness, I guess.
The
And you know,
anti-TV rhetoric, the bragging about I don't even own a TV,
right.
was sort of the idea is like I'm different somehow.
I'm different,
Yeah.
and also like I'm, you know, like it was in a sense a kind of proto version of, I guess, the kind of culture we have now where people perform their kind of refusal to be, you know, like to go along with certain noxious cultural trends. I put
Yeah.
that line in our big song as a joke. I mean, it
You know what's funny? I didn't even
seems
realize
worth
I was
mentioning.
about to quote that the line from that song.
Yeah,
It just came out because it's such. I mean, there are a lot of lines from that song. They became like cultural tropes in one way or another, which must be
yeah.
weird.
It's
Um,
fucking weird.
yeah.
It's still weird because it's still, they still come up, and
It's a
like,
zeitgeisty song. I mean,
yeah, it is.
it's a song that, I mean, arguably, it must be weird to sort of know that you made a song that is arguably the song of the era, or that defines something about it, and still does, and so
Yeah.
like that whole I don't even own TV. I hear it like, oh, I'm not on Twitter, I'm not on Facebook, you
Well
know.
done.
There's the
You're a
idea that
braver, you're a better man than I am, Gungadin.
but you know that idea about of not being a zombie was so
Well, you
present.
know, I'm
Yeah.
not on Twitter and I'm not on Facebook. It's the new I don't even own a TV.
Right. Yeah.
But like that song, as long as we're talking about it, it is meant to be like a litany of the shit people say that is kind of somewhat hollow. Like to say you
Mm-hmm.
don't even own a TV, well, you know, that's like great, you know, and I think it meant more in the 90s than it would mean now, because you can watch, you can binge watch every television program ever made
Right.
without owning a TV. And so it's not like, you know, but like the idea of television as this great uh narcotic thing, that was just making everybody into complacent sleepwalkers, that was a real idea, and it was like there was truth in it, except when you're young you don't understand necessarily how like that kind of narcotic that doesn't destroy your body, except by making it sedentary. Like it has like some real charm when you're exhausted from working,
Well, there's something
and
Freudian about it too, because you said how much we watch TV when we were young,
yeah,
and then by the time I get to be a jaded 19-year-old, I'm like fucking TV's bullshit, and anyone who
yeah,
watches it is stupid. And I'm kind of
right,
like, there's a little bit of like sort of feeling like I wasted my time with it or something. And as I get
yeah.
older and drop that, I just kind of love a lot of the TV I watched when I was young.
I know. Well, I mean, the TV I watched when I was actually a kid is, to me, so much more resonant than memories of my like family interactions because I didn't have anything like my family
Mm-hmm.
was a mess
Mm.
from basically the age of like 4. I grew up in LA and in the Valley and in Hollywood, and my parents were like, they were fine people, but like they were very self-destructive and they were also mutually destructive, and
Mm.
they, like they were into that whole culture and all the trappings of it, and like they didn't have a lot of time for the rest of it. And then the kind of the second draft families where my parents got divorced and then remarried, there was a different kind of uh seemingly benign neglect that actually was a little bit malignant, but like
I've
I
never
just
heard the
did.
term second draft families. That's great.
That's what I think of it as,
Yeah.
like my mother and stepfather had 2 kids in rapid succession who are my little brothers. They're my little half brothers, and I love them and we're close. But like they had a childhood that was much more like the kind of childhood that happens on television shows that I was watching to try and have a proxy version of that for myself. So, like, I you're right to identify it as Freudian, and I don't think I've ever thought of it that way, but of course that's exactly what it is. And the rejection of it as you're an adolescent or post-adolescent is in keeping with that, like, like killing the parent. And when you're raised by a fucking television set, it's much easier to kill that figure.
Uh,
But, I have been just lately, and this is, I don't know if it's necessarily the ideal illustration, but like I have gone back and watched a number of things that back then I just simply like patently refused to watch or even to acknowledge the possibility of there being anything worthwhile about them. Again, even if they were funny, like Seinfeld is a good one. Of course, I was exposed to it because it was so ubiquitous by the end of its run.
right.
Um, but like, I remember we played a show in North Carolina on the night of the final Seinfeld episode, and there was so much news about that show ending, and I was just like, well, we were doing really well at that moment, and all of our shows were selling out, and we were selling tons of records, and I was like, people aren't gonna fucking stay home and watch TV. They're gonna go out to a show. And of course, there were like 30 people in
I was
attendance,
gonna
and everyone
say,
was watching
wow.
that show, but which is fine. And I tell you now, I would do the same thing probably, but I have gone back and become really, really fascinated by, almost obsessed with, but like really into the show NYPD Blue, which
Yeah.
I knew about. I had heard of it. I was like, yeah, me
Yeah.
too.
Yep.
Um,
We're both reading the David Milch memoir, and yeah, I'm just at the point where he's writing NYPD Blue with Steve. Yeah, there you go, Stephen
That
Bochco, and it's
Milch,
just yeah,
Milch
unbelievable.
is Milch is really one of the most intriguing and like enlightened and enlightening figures
Yeah,
that I
I
have
agree.
come across. And I cannot believe that I spent this much of my life not even really knowing about him. Of course, I knew about Deadwood and I loved it, but I still was like, oh, but he did NYPD, he did these cop shows on TV. Who
Yeah,
gives a
who
shit?
cares? Yeah.
Meanwhile, I go back and watch NYPD Blue and discover this world of like almost metaphysical inquiry into the ways that human beings can redeem, even the worst human beings can redeem themselves, and how how doing doing and thinking and terrible, indefensible things does not disqualify people from being humans and being, whatever. So,
Yeah.
like, the central figure of that show is a racist cop, kind of a cliche of a racist cop in some ways, if you look at it just on the surface, but in fact, nothing like a cliche. And over the course of the seasons of the show, he not only grows out of his most horrible tendencies, but the show is about him like coming to that reformation in himself. And
I gotta watch it. I didn't watch it when I was younger at all for probably the same reasons. I was snarky and thinking, oh, it's not for me. But yeah,
all I
Milch is
knew
yeah.
all I knew about it was the show where you could see like people's butts,
Right.
and
Yeah.
they could say shit or whatever. But and so I just like there was no chance I would have ever watched it. My parents liked it, and that was another against it in a way. But like I just didn't. It was the natural thing during the pandemic of like, well, I've watched every fucking other thing that's ever been made.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll just try it because I love Deadwood and I'll just give it a shot. And I was absolutely riveted by it. And I've now, in the last couple of years, I've watched the entire, God, like 11-year or 10-year
Hey,
run
that's a
of it,
lot.
like 4 times maybe.
Let's
I
do
was
an
just watching
NYPD
it
Blue
again.
podcast. We got to come up with a clever name for it, though.
Well, there was one.
There's got
I
to be.
looked
Yeah, they're
around.
doing them
There
already.
there was one called NYPD Blue Balls that was done by a couple of real kind of dudes,
That
and
wasn't the first pun that came to mind, but
probably not. But like I would happily talk about that show for hours and hours and hours because it's so rich. It's so
well,
rich.
Deadwood is like that. I mean, and
Well, yeah.
and reading Milch's life story of him, like just his obsession with like gambling and heroin and his parents. I mean, it's just fucking insane. Like his life story is nuts, and he has a way of articulating things in just that matter of fact, straightforward way that's got a poetry to it too. I mean, he's a great writer. He's someone
He
who
is a
more people
great
should know.
writer.
Yeah.
Great writer, but also a great like epistemological like
Yeah, right.
inquiry into the nature of being a human. And it really like it's to me it is as like involving and as gripping. His writing, I mean, is as gripping as any of the great novelists that I have loved, or
Mm-hmm.
or I guess philosophers, though I tend not to. I'm not so good at having read a lot of philosophy because the
Yeah, me
prose
neither.
is just horrible. So, um, and the ideas are fascinating, but like reading the texts has been something that I have
It's a
tried and
form and
failed.
content thing. Like
Yeah,
the aesthetic of philosophers is often just so boring. Yeah.
and it's also in translation most of the time, and so that's tricky.
Mm-hmm.
But like he was like, there is a fantastic series of lectures that he did when there was a writers' strike in like 2007, and he did these classes for the Writers Guild for the people on strike, just like because he was an academic. He was first in his class at Yale, and
Yeah.
he, was a devout Henry James and William James scholar, and
Iowa
um,
Writers Workshop with Kurt Vonnegut. I mean, it
yeah,
just goes on and on. Yeah.
yeah. His credentials are super legit, especially in terms of Hollywood. But like he's quoting Kierkegaard. He's quoting like pages of Kierkegaard from memory, and the ideas that are coming out are at first you're like, sorry, what does this have to do with writing screenplays? But it has everything to do with writing anything, and it's I have felt very estranged from writing for the last,
Mm.
I don't know, 6 years, 5, 6 years before the pandemic world, but like, more or less in consonant with the rise of Donald Trump, I guess. That's not exactly why, but the question of like, who is the audience? Who's reading? And what is the possibility of writing something meaningful that in journalism anyway that isn't just like deflected by all these millions of people who now are, I guess, charged with having opinions that they wouldn't have had before if they didn't
Mm-hmm.
have a way to broadcast them.
Yeah.
um the environment into which writing has to, struggle to exist is so hostile. It's so like inherently hostile
Yeah.
that it's hard to you have to really be devout, I think, to write. I mean,
Mm,
you also have to be
mm.
good and you have to work hard like you always did, but it's more than that now. You have to like there is a hurdle, and I guess maybe the hurdle is how much you care about what people say and how they automatically swat everything down or whatever.
Right,
um
right.
it's hard for me to want to, like I just for a long time I wrote journalism while I was writing songs and while I was working in films and stuff. I always did it. It was always my day job when, like work as a performer or whatever dried up for a little while, or kind of lean times, or even times when I was making an okay living doing that stuff, but I still was like feeling disaffected. I would go back and write journalism because I loved doing it. I always loved that kind of critical and
Mm-hmm.
satirical thing. But I mean, it's certainly possible that I was just not that good, and like time winnowed me out. But like, it doesn't feel like that to me, and maybe it's self-serving, but like I just don't know who the fuck I would be addressing anymore.
Yeah, yeah, I know what you mean. Like that, the fractured element of it is intense, and it's weird. There's a weird irony to it too, because like we're talking about like desiring something, some alternative, and it feels like the impulse to create social media and people to sort of like be in that world is almost in some way the fruition of it. At least that's how it was sold to us. Like
Right.
it was
But
sold that like you're all free now and I don't know that thing that really resonates with me in terms of writing. And because I've read a lot, including Milch's book, about like creativity and like how to be creative and how do you get to that space. I mean, there are a million fucking YouTube videos about
sure.
how to get there, and so much of it is about sort of shutting off, those critical voices. Most often the ego and like your
Well, yeah.
own voice, but also how could you possibly write something to everybody, like that everybody's and you're right. Now that everybody's here, you can't help but hear that noise, and that static is distracting for sure.
Not to mention the kind of generally lowered bar,
Mm,
that is inherent to the democratizing of a practice that really has no room for democracy. Like writing shouldn't be, it's not like writing and art is not, those are not democratic arts, like it is true that anyone should be able to do it, but everyone shouldn't do it, like there are people who are simply bad writers and weak thinkers and just
mm.
like shallow people. But now because anybody can, a lot of people do, but they do it in a way that's like, swatting things down on Twitter stands in for a reasoned critical
Right,
thought,
right, and
and
you're not supposed to you're not supposed to say that either. Kind of an
I
idea,
know.
because it is sort of like, well, I mean, the Facebook commercial is going to show you, and all the sort of line from Silicon Valley is that this allows us to see that everybody has this incredible talent, and part of me sometimes like sees singers on YouTube, and I'm like, wow, we never would have found this person otherwise, but
No doubt
um
that is absolutely true. It
but
has
the other part of it is like we shy away from saying that like some people are better at things than others.
it has allowed marginalized and previously unexposed talent to emerge, and that is absolutely true. However, it has also allowed mediocre thinking to dominate the entire discourse. And it has also provided a situation where, uh, I mean, you see it increasingly with like the way people respond to fictional work, like films, narrative films in which characters are not exemplary. That used to be kind of that was used to be considered a positive, interesting notion. Like there was a lot of stuff in there. 70s cinema
Oh
in
yeah,
America. What we're
yeah.
kind of
You're
talking about.
preaching to the choir, man.
I
I
know,
yeah, I hear this.
but it also that has also been has translated also to like figurative language is so objectionable to people. Like you have to advertise what you think rather than say, like, like take some time to actually spell out what you're saying and leave it to the reader. If you leave it to the reader, you're fucking screwed, because the reader doesn't want to find it. They want to find fault with it. I think a lot of the time, maybe I'm overstating that, but
no, we're being grumpy old men.
I know.
But no, I think but the thing is, it's weird because, speaking generationally, I mean, the New York Times, I mean, they just had an article like a couple weeks ago about like young people who are rejecting social media and don't want phones, and sort of like, it reminds me of the 90s. There's sort of like these young people who are like kind of like, fuck this culture, and we're gonna I don't even own a TV, like I don't have a phone and I don't do that. And it's sort of like, to me, there's something really profound about it, that young people having this sense that like, I have to disconnect from this technology that's delivering like values and ideas to me. Even though now, as we're older, we're kind of like, oh, our rejection of TV was sort of kind of broad and hokey in some ways. And there's good stuff. It was like
being a vegan or something, or like voting for Nader. It was an embrace of a fringe, and there was a degree of like, obviously it's impossible to fully reject television because it dominates the culture in a way that no other medium ever has. However, like, you still would, like, even in my most anti-television time, on Sunday nights, I would go over to my friend's house and they would wheel the TV out of the closet and plug it in and let it warm up. And we'd watch X-Files for an hour and then turn it off and put it back in the closet. Like,
Bohemians did that with Twin Peaks in the 80s too, I think.
Yeah. Well, I went to a boarding school for high school against my will. I was sent away. But the chaplain at my school used to tape on VHS Twin Peaks and like sneak it to us so we could watch it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was, I mean, you're right. There's always been that. But like, I am not the first. I am in no way claiming this as my insight, but I don't remember where I first read it. But like, the idea that this kind of embrace of the democratization of access that is afforded by social media is in fact just a shadow on the cave wall kind of situation for the absence of democracy in our governed lives. Like, people don't have access to democracy in life, and so they wield it against the arts in a way that is so, it's understandable, and it is like, you get where it's coming from. You get that it is the cry of the oppressed creature or whatever, but also it's the enemy of the art.
Well, all right, folks, I think that's going to do it for part 1 of our conversation with Sean Nelson. If you want to check out part 2, it is up right now on the Nostalgia Trap Patreon page for our subscribers. The link is in the episode description, or you can just go to patreon.com/nostalgiatrap, or just Google it, whatever you got to do. I have faith that you can find it. But part 2 is where we get into the history of Harvey Danger, and Sean is just really candid and really great in talking about pop stardom and what it means and how much it's changed since the 90s. Really fun, really deep stuff. Go check it out, and thanks so much for listening to Nostalgia Trap. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.